Hello, Aaron Lelito here with an episode of the Wild Roof podcast. Today, I have a writer to speak with a little bit and get to know. His name is Jacob Riyeff, and he has a new poetry collection out called Be Radiant. So there's some interesting things to get into about the new book, as well as Jacob's background. And so I'll let him introduce himself a little bit. Who are you, and kind of how did you come to poetry and releasing your new book?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Aaron. So yeah, Jacob Riyeff. I grew up in Wisconsin. I'm back now after some traveling during the 20s. But I was taken with poetry from early on. I mean, I was like the 13-year-old writing the bad, terrible verses, right? And then thinking they were okay, and then burning them all 5 years later because I was like, oh my God, what was I doing? But I had the passion for it, right? Like I wanted to do it. And I started reading the romantics pretty early, but when I found out about Ginsberg and Kerouac, the whole beat thing was kind of what did me in, and made me say, this is like a way of life. Okay, you know. So yeah, and I kind of dropped out of society for several years after high school. And one of the mainstays of intellectual life for me and artistic life was still poetry. And I was in Boulder, Colorado, and I was able to use UC Boulder's library. Thankfully, they allowed me to get a card and stuff. And that's what I kind of kept checking out and kept feeling like this is what I need to read tonight until it's done. And so a big gap here. And then one time I was in California and I was reading, I was actually looking for some Old Norse poetry, the Eddas, if you know those. And I saw a J.R.R. Tolkien book in the Edda section. I was like, what is Tolkien doing over here? I had no idea that he was actually an Anglo-Saxonist and studied Old English poetry, and that was actually his day job. But here it was, like one of his edited collections. And oh, sorry, not edited collections. One of his editions of an Old English poem, and I saw it, and I can still see that moment in the stacks, sitting on the floor with the terrible brown carpeting and everything, looking at that page of Old English poetry and saying, "I have no idea what this is, but like I need to know." Like 2004 or something like that, 2005, and so I just like I applied to university and got in. And started realizing, like you could actually make a go of this, and like this could be your living if you did it right. And but like for me, the undergrad degree and the graduate degree were really about learning more and more about especially medieval poetry and medieval languages. But in that, as I kept doing that, needed a break from like the heavy reading and stuff, I would start writing my own poems again. Finally, after like 5, 6 years at least, and realized I actually just really enjoyed doing that too. And then they kind of started blending together a lot. I started doing more translating. And anyway, so that's kind of how this particular collection came to be, by the long road. Yeah.
Sure, yeah, I can. I feel like maybe a lot of people out there maybe can have their own kind of library experience, that
Yes.
where like the light bulb goes off moment. Like I didn't know this was out there.
Yeah.
Um, so I appreciate that. Um, just to maybe take one step back, just on a personal level, Kerouac is somebody who slipped through the cracks for me. And
Ah.
just last year, at this point, 2024, is when I read On the Road, believe
Oh,
that or
really?
not.
Oh,
That's like it wasn't something I studied, it wasn't something I
yeah.
picked up. That was just kind of like this blank spot as everybody has with
Yep.
different writers or different periods.
Yeah.
And then Ginsberg I had maybe a little more familiar with, but I definitely read more of him last year
Hmm.
than I ever had before. So I'm just curious, like when you discovered those writers in particular, and you mentioned just the Beat generation,
Yeah.
um, can you say a little bit like what was that spark that you had at that younger self where
Yeah.
that really kind of spoke to you, decades later?
It may not have been the best thing for me to be reading when I was a kid. but, bless my parents for allowing me to kind of explore the arts as I wanted. That you know, some parts of that probably weren't great for me at that age, but they did show me. I mean, the kind of bohemian thing, right? That like you can, and of course, I'm, between kind of working a middle class kid and a factory town in Wisconsin, so it's not like I was living the life or anything. But like, I think when you're young, there is a kind of wildness in you still, right? That like it's hard to keep and maintain, and especially in the adults around me, I don't see it that much. And the ones that were like, I don't want to be like that, um, but these guys were, channeling it into their art. And again, they, their personal lives, they made some poor choices, made some good choices, whatever, like we all do. Um, but they were, a little more honest probably about all of their choices than a lot of us are, bringing them out in the open. But even that, right? Like the kind of integrity that displayed. I feel like, I mean, of course, looking back 30 years, well, 25 years later, it's, easy to say what you knew then. But I feel like I did kind of intuit there was an integrity to that kind of living. Again, even if it's not exactly the best things all the time, there's an integrity to that. And there's a kind of a beauty in living your art and making art your life and those kinds of things. And not worrying about kind of, bourgeois morality as being the end all be all of what we're doing here, and consumerism being the kind of release that you have, and those two things are kind of shaping all of life. Those two aspects of what they were doing were very appealing, especially as a young nonconformist in a not a small town, but small enough. But then on the other hand, just the art itself. I mean, especially Ginsberg, just the kind of effusive, long lines, that just going on until Sunday. I loved that. Kerouac's, his prose, but also his poems. I mean, I don't think he gets enough credit for his poems. They're great, but his novels, I mean, surely that's where he put most of his energy and his skill. But some of those lines, actually, I just finally reread all of them. It's funny that you bring up finding him now because I loved him until I was about 20, and then I was like, okay, I think I'm done with this guy. And I kind of came back to him in my early 30s. Like yeah, right near the end of grad school, I was like, let's just like get back to some of the old things I used to read. And the Romantics held up a little bit more for me. Kerouac, I was like, this guy's a punk, actually, a total punk. I can't stand him, I think. you know, like still skilled, but I couldn't stand. But then 3 or 4 years ago, I picked up something again. It was Dharma Bums, maybe. Uh, and it spoke to me again. And I could see, because there are those very rough edges to Kerouac's personality and his writing style that feel a little, I don't know if arrogant's the right word, but there's a little bit of, edging toward that at least sometimes. Um, and then I started to see it again, I guess maybe it's just getting older. I started to see that even with a little more sympathy. That's kind of like, he's just like being really honest about who he is. And that can sound arrogant, but he's really just like, I'm just not going to pretend like this isn't happening, or I'm not going to like cover the edges here. I'm just like going for it. And also knowing probably, that it was kind of going to sound not great. Some of the things that he's saying, and saying no, but that's real. So I'm just putting it out there, and I'll embrace it. Yeah, even that I started to kind of enjoy more, and like maybe he's goofing on himself a little. Anyway, I could go on and on, but
Yeah.
rereading the whole thing, some of those passages, oh my gosh! And actually, on the road, actually, that's funny, Aaron. I will say, on the road, I purposefully didn't read when I was younger. So I never read on the road until like 2 or 3 years ago, because that was what, like, when I found out that this is a whole thing, everybody reads on the road first. I was the nonconformist, so I was like, nope, not reading on the road. Screw that. I'm too good for on the road. you know. So my own arrogance, as a young man, I was too good for on the road. But it is. It's great. It's a great novel. It's a great novel. I'm mellowed enough now that I can enjoy it. But um, yeah, Big
It's
Sur, I think
funny,
actually
yeah.
my favorite.
Oh, what was the last part?
Big Sur, I think, is my favorite
Oh,
of his
gotcha.
work. Yeah,
Yeah, I was gonna
there's
say
great moments
it's
of other ones,
funny.
but Yeah.
how like yeah, sometimes with a certain writer or there's a certain book that I don't know if you felt like some of them for me like oh like I'll save that one or some of them like you
Mm.
said you feel like that one's not for me.
Yeah.
But when you actually do read it, you can kind of see it and appreciate it.
Yeah.
Um,
There was a
yeah,
bit of wow, I kind of missed out on that. Like I
yeah,
didn't read it.
yeah. And for me, it wasn't really even a Kerouac in particular wasn't like a conscious like I'm avoiding this. It just like I
Yeah.
said wasn't in my as a reference point for me.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, like the so we got kind of a little bit about your early kind of inspirations and entry point. Um, so yeah, well, I mean, we could kind of like connect a little bit to your academic interest with Old English. You could speak a little bit more about kind of your specialization.
Mhm.
Um, but then Nick, I'm kind of curious, like how do you connect those two? Because that's like in maybe most people's minds, that's something very different to like contemporary poetry
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
contemporary writing. Like, what does it have to do with? I don't want to feel like one of your students. Like, what does that have to do with like life today? But
Yeah.
it just how do you like kind of bridge the gap between your academic study and like maybe what you're more interested in as a writer?
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to separate them, frankly. I think that's why I've been able to stay in academia. I think if it really had been something that I was just doing intellectually and that was all, I probably would have quit a while ago. Um, but the again, like I mean, when I tell people that, I mean, especially in academia, when I tell them like I really did a PhD because I wanted to know more about Old English poetry so I could like translate it and just like read it better. People take me at I don't think they believe that. And that's fine. But like it's really true. Um, and so for me, it was always a living poetic thing. Like I just loved the art of it. So I mean, there was that moment with Tolkien in the library, but then even I did my undergrad at UW-Madison, and Sherry Reams, who I can't say enough good things about. She was my advisor there, but I went to the Old English class in my sophomore year, and she started it classically, no words of modern English. She just started reading Old English poetry to us. And I was like, yeah, this is the way to do it. But hearing that, I was like, okay, this is it. Like, this is what I'm doing now. And so, and actually, a little bit later on, again, because I went to school later, I had a friend who was a couple years ahead of me, and he was going out, and he was talking about grad school, and I was like, "Oh, you going to grad school still? Or is that going to happen?" And he's like, "Oh no, you know what? I'm going like whatever his other job was going to be, and he was going to go do something else." And I asked him why, and he said, "It just feels like the every tower thing, you know. I can't do this. It just doesn't feel like the real world, and I don't want to do that the rest of my life." And I thought it was so funny because, and like I respected his decision, of course, but it was funny because to me, the academia was the only place I ever felt like I kind of fit into society a little bit. Like, yeah, I can contribute something productive here. Um, and so to me, it was like, yeah, this is like the practical work that I can do, I guess. It was like teaching and researching, I guess, a little bit, but the artistic part of Old English and Middle English, a little bit of Latin, but mostly the vernacular for me. It really was a sense of this is a living language if we still read it, you know? Like it's dead. Nobody can understand this stuff if you don't take special courses and everything. Like I get that. But it's still alive if we're willing to engage with it, right? Like any poetry, in any language. It becomes part of who we are if we allow ourselves to come into its orbit, you know? And for me, especially, what I find fascinating, I don't think everybody has to, even with when they're interested in Old English, but like for me, what's interesting about it is, and this kind of gets toward the book, is the continuity amidst difference, right? Like the kind of this reading Old English, and I'm sorry for listeners who may not be familiar with this. I forget that people don't spend their days doing this. Old English is 450 to 1100. CE. That's, the English language is written and spoken then. So Beowulf is the thing most people know from it, but there's so much more, of course, and everybody should read all of it. But you know, for anyone who speaks English, I mean, I think all art is for everybody, but especially for those who speak English. English is what you operate in. It doesn't matter to me, like from an artistic perspective, where your ancestors are from. If you speak English, these are your linguistic ancestors, at least, right? And Seamus Heaney has just a beautiful thing about that in his introduction to his translation of Beowulf, where he talks about, his being from Northern Ireland. He's got a lot of problems with the British. He's got problems with English as a language and working in English as his native tongue, because it is the language of the colonizer, right? It is the imperial language that was forced upon him and his co-citizens, whatever. But he says going back to Old English, and he gives the examples why I won't go into the details of that. But he says going back to Old English, this is before the first incursion of the British into Ireland, right? And so this is like a deep wellspring of the language that he could embrace and feel good about and feel like it's equally his because it wasn't the colonizer yet, and then that kind of therapy, I guess, that medicine helped him embrace his own language that he was raised with, in a different way. And I don't, have those kinds of traumatic, kinds of elements in my own history of why I speak English, but I still think that his insight there applies, like having this kind of deep historical past with the language is just a lot of fun and it's beautiful. And it opens up, I think, at least vocabulary kinds of things that, you're just not going to find if you only read modern stuff. And I do think my own poetics, my own prosody, like my line, tends to be influenced by it's a bad imitation of Old English lines a lot of the time, kind of forced stresses, and I don't worry too much about the syllables in between. So it's metrical, but not how most people would say metrical poetry is supposed to be, and so I kind of like to ride that line in between them, right? But again, then getting back around finally to the specific question there, I think that only reading new, and only reading old, I don't know. It's just why? Why not read all of it? Like there's just so much there. And to see the progression, like the progression is really fascinating. And when I was doing my graduate study, we had like a poetics, like an informal poetics reading group thing, right? Where we all just met for like, twice a month or something to talk for 2 hours about poetics. And I was definitely out of my depth a lot of the time because these people were like the serious theorist people, and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing here, but it was fun still, and they allowed me in, so it was good. But there were moments when they would talk as if like people hadn't done things before the last 150 years, and I just had to be like, well, guys, what about this and that and that and that? And they would be like, oh, yeah, I guess people did do things like in 1300. Sure, okay, let's talk about that too. And so I think it's a good corrective, to the hyper presentist lens, of the modern world.
Yeah, I don't think I've really thought about it in those terms or like in that context. Um, it's in my world it's probably like, or actually that the first English class as an English major that I took was Middle English. Like
Oh,
the
nice.
like the first one that was like in the English major. And so
Yeah.
like I think of it as like, kind of fondly in a way. It was like that experience. But
Yeah.
it's not something that I like, pursued in terms of something to read.
Hmm. Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, where does it come from? It has, roots that go back and those that go
Yeah.
back and those go back and those go back.
Right.
So, you don't typically in an everyday sense maybe think of it as connected, but of course it is. Yeah, why wouldn't it be?
Yeah. And
Um,
that's, I think that's, you know, in culture in general. there's that reality that I mean, because culture isn't about like, in tradition, right? Like it's not about replicating the past. It's about carrying things on, right? And some things you drop and some things you keep holding on to. Um and I think we kind of pretend as if culture's just made all of a sudden and we just started doing these things 20 years ago and like never the case. Never the case, you know. And it's just it gives you a richer palette or something, to explore the older stuff too. But I will say too, I have, you know, colleagues artistically and in the academy who like the old stuff to the exclusion of the new, and I think that's also kind of like no, like Ginsberg's awesome. It does like Ginsberg is he's a great poet. I don't care if you don't like free verse. He's amazing, you know? Like you don't-
Yeah, I think that
just
that's there's probably a good lesson in there to kind of keep some flexibility with like being
yeah,
open to different, even yeah, it doesn't have to be what you read every night, but kind of
right.
keeping up an appreciation for um even yeah, different styles and time periods.
Yeah.
Um yeah, do you mind if I read one of the blurbs from your book and then you could say a little bit about kind of skipping over to the collection?
Okay, sure. Yeah.
I was trying to decide which of the two to start with. So, um, this one, just from the blurb from the book Be Radiant. The blurb is from David Russell Mosley. It says Jacob Rieff's Be Radiant does precisely what it proclaims. Rieff's poetry comes in a variety of styles and forms, but each poem radiates with a sense of time and place. Riyeff, like the fungi he loves so much, is a poet rooted in place. His poems reflect this rootedness. Riyeff, as a scholar, is also rooted in the English language. He weds these he weds these two in poems like The Ruin, which is a translation of an Old English poem, and yet Riyeff places it before a burial mound in his home of Milwaukee. So the aspect of that blurb that one of them that stood out as I was looking through the collection is that sense of place is a big part of the collection and what makes it, engaging as a reader to get a sense of where you're coming from, as a person and like where you're coming from in your kind of personal history, family history. So you could talk a little bit about the place, but I'm also interested in like what's your fascination with fungi. You can go whichever direction you want with that blurb.
Sure. That's that we could spend a while on fungi, I suppose. I'll stay away from that too much. But well, no, I mean, I think they're intimately related for me. I guess, yeah. One way to get at that is this collection is very much 'cause this is my second collection. My first one came out 2017 or 18, something like that. And it kind of been everything from before. That moment that I had saved basically. A bunch of it I actually did burn a long time ago, but it was like everything up until that point. So this is 2019 and on. But 2019 I hadn't done a lot, and so the vast majority of this book is post or during the pandemic and after is what I'm getting at. Um, and I had always been, I guess I was writing the line between bohemian and hippie, I guess. I hate these terms, of course, but don't want to like label yourself as these, but yeah, that's the kind of stuff I was doing. Um, and so I had a kind of sensibility that liked the earth and earthiness, and you don't have to shave every day, and you don't have to wear shoes, and you got what just that kind of way of being in the world. And that was what went along with that was let's like just go walk in when I was in Boulder, let's just go walk into the mountains, and I don't know, let's just do that today. That's what we should do, like we don't have to have a purpose, we don't have to have a goal here, just like go do it. And here in Wisconsin we've got a lot of woods and prairies, and like I don't know, let's just go walk in the woods, we'll find a stream and sit in the stream. I don't know, like that's what we'll do today. um so I've always loved that, right? Just like let's get out of the built world a little bit, and that'll be what we do today. But I never took the time to really learn like what are these things? You know, mushrooms, that's the one exception. I actually I really enjoyed fungi enough to like understand identification and stuff like that early, and I grew mushrooms a lot and whatever. Um but yeah, I felt like I love this and I love the earth and I love being outside of it, but I never really took the time to understand like ecosystems and habitats and like geological systems and all that. But the pandemic, all of a sudden there was so much more time in a lot of ways. For those of us who were okay during it, right? Um, but so I decided to use a lot of that time to like let's actually start learning about this stuff. So let's go to the woods, but actually like understand what kind of wood we're going to and what are the kinds of trees that are growing in this one and why and that kind of stuff. What are the differences between bogs and marshes and swamps? I want to actually understand this stuff now, right? And get into it a little bit more. Um, and so as I was walking the land with my wife and my kids, my kids who were really into it at first, and after probably a year of it, they were kind of like, "Dad, do we have to keep doing like, can we just stay home this weekend and not go out to the woods?" So that was fine. It became a running joke a little bit in my household, but to me, the getting to know the earth and getting to know the creatures that share it with us was I wanted that intellectual knowledge to some degree that like I just know what kind of plant that is now. I know the difference between a swamp and a bog, right? Like there's an analytical knowledge to that. Um, but that's not enough, right? And there's a couple poems in here that address this, this confluence directly. But Saint Gregory the Great, as a medievalist, I read Gregory the Great and John Cassian and stuff like for fun. These guys, they're just good. They're good. They're good. They're doing some cool stuff way back 1,500 years ago. Um, but Gregory the Great talks about how talks about loving knowledge, right? And that actually the way to know something the best is to love it more, right? Like the more and more that we love something, the more and more we actually understand it. And I don't think he was being kind of metaphorical when he's talking about like that. I mean, he means it very seriously and literally. Um, and I think that that was kind of the last few years of my life was I want to actually like understand habitats and I want to be able to identify plants and actually know the things that are like living out in the world alongside us, even though we it's very easy not to ever notice them, right? I guess and that was it. Like I want to notice. I want to train the eye, right, to actually see them and to get to know them a little bit and but in knowing them to love them. Uh, and that was, and this is in one of the lino cuts that I did for the book, which I was so glad that Fernwood allowed me to do some of my own visual art because I'm not a visual artist. That's not my thing. It's amateur art for sure, but it's art, and it goes I think along with my poetry fairly well. Like the aesthetic I think matches. So I was I was very happy they allowed me to do that. But one of them has this little line from a 12th century canon, Richard of Saint Victor that translated is where love is, there is the eye. And I started taking that as really instructive um, in general. If we, because we can say that we love the earth and we can say that we care about other creatures all day long. And it doesn't mean that it's not true, but like if we don't actually know them, if we're not relating to them, it's tougher to see how that actually changes who we are, right? And that's I think Gregory gets at with the loving knowledge is like knowledge will actually start changing you. It's not just objective information you happen to be able to recall, right? It's knowing on a deeper level, knowing that actually changes subjectively who we are. And so getting to know the place of Milwaukee and southern Wisconsin in general and the Baraboo Hills, which is an ancient mountain range, like an hour and a half, 2 hours west of me here in Milwaukee, getting to know Lake Michigan, all these places, southern Wisconsin in general, and a little bit of California. There's a little California in the mix there, but um, that's a different story. But getting to that place is about getting to know the creatures that share it with us, and all of that's about getting to know ourselves in a new light, I think, too. And the poetry, the art is a kind of way of focalizing that. It's a way of articulating it for myself and for anyone else who cares to actually come along for the ride. Because I do think, we're the audience of our own art. Um, once it's objectified somewhere in the world, whether it's text or stone or music, whatever it is, we're an audience for it. So I do enjoy that aspect of these things, and that's the living found poem thing from the State Natural Area Poems. That's part of the collection. Um, is very much what's here. Let's just record it. Let's try to, and that gets back kind of the Kerouac and Ginsberg thing. I'm just like whatever's there, just spontaneous, just put it down. Like get it there. Um, but it's always a shaping at the same time, right? It's not an actual objective thing. It's always objective and subjective at the same time. And so anyway, that's yeah, like training my eye through meter, uh through line, through all the new words I was learning, right? Like I yeah. A spathe. I didn't know what a spathe was before I started doing this, right? But it's a very particular part of a very particular plant. And all of a sudden I could use spathe accurately. And like all of a sudden, like a poem developed that could never have been written from by me before, right? Because I all of a sudden I know this new word. I know that kind of stuff. It opened up a whole world of poetics too.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, so yeah, there's so much there, but I think it is interesting because you're kind of working with that interplay of like, yeah, knowing the place or knowing these creatures and plants that you're coming across, but then kind of the other half of it is like you're bringing yourself to those plants and you're having a subjective experience that you're bringing to this,
Yeah.
the plant maybe is what it is. It has its own cycle, its own life cycle. Um, but yeah, you're kind of bringing kind of the human interaction element to it. So like you
Mhm.
said, even the objective kind of set of poems, the little like mini micro observational poems, like that's still like, your stylistic choice and your observational choices and things like that. So there is that interplay even on the more observational side.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think like another thing I was curious about um, was maybe like the personal experiences that you're kind of bringing in. So I know like, yeah, you mentioned like the writing process took place right in 2020 pandemic time. That it was actually the creation process of a lot of I guess, the inspiration for the poems, if not the actual writing of them.
Yeah.
Were there other aspects of who you are that came into the collection?
Yeah, I suppose I can't avoid it, right? Yeah, I think I mean, what we're always selecting, I mean, it very much in, or like an analogy of, or metaphorically with, or just, in common with that the observational poems are still subjective, right? Like we're always filtering, like that is the subjective reality, right? So we're filtering the world to some degree, right? And we're taking in all these stimuli all the time. What do we actually give our attention to, and what, has an impact on us and actually stays with us is a pretty limited amount of all the stuff going on, right? Even in pretty, ambient kinds of ecosystems like the office that I'm in right now. Um, but yeah, like on a larger stage, I suppose these things that I actually care about are just all those things too, right? Over a lifetime, there's still all these things that you're paying attention to that maybe other people don't, and they pay attention to things that you don't, right? Um, but yeah, so I think especially in the long poem, Leads and Diggings, it's the only long poem in the collection. I kind of gave up. I did some long poems a long time ago, and I kind of got tired of I just feel like I didn't have the stamina to like make it interesting the whole way through. But Leads and Diggings, this one, I felt like yes, I kind of nailed something there. Because I know you had alluded to this a little earlier, but I started thinking about family. So my kids are in this fairly regularly because my kids are, especially during COVID, during lockdown or shutdown, whatever. They were there a lot, right? And you have three kids in a small flat. It was cozy for a long time there. So I couldn't not write about them. But they're also just my kids anyway, right? So I mean, they're part of this deal. But I was also getting more interested in my ancestry, and it was another one of those things that like I always wanted to actually know, like where did they come from? How did they get here? What were they doing when they got here and stuff like that. Um, but just there's not, not world enough in time, that kind of thing. and so never did it. But all of a sudden there was time, so I started putting, the real effort into going through everything my mom's collected, and all these photographs and family tree things and all that, and started to realize like these weren't two different projects. They kind of just going out to the woods or the prairies or the lake and, learning about it and kind of inhabiting the earth in a way that I hadn't for a long time. Learning about my ancestors and my family, um, the longer trajectory of where me as an organism came from, all of a sudden it was like, yeah, no, these are actually the exact same thing, right? This is just like this subjective, bundle of neurons and tissues and all these things, like it came together because of all of these other factors. And I'm a one nexus of billions of nexuses or whatever the plural is on that. But I can sing that, right? I can sing about that thing. Um, Being this coming from all of these different factors. And so the leads and diggies is kind of bringing the familial and the geological together. So not just my kids, but also like these generations going back mostly to like the 1830s, 1840s, but even some trying to get back into like deep geological time, going back millions and millions of years, going back to the last ice age ending, and then going back to Europe a little bit, to Cornwall especially, because some of my family came from Cornwall in the 1830s. Um, and seeing the resonances there, like wanting to be really careful about that because the kind of colonial reality of all of it, like I'm sensitive to it, but it's also what we've all been given, and trying to explore that, which felt a little dicey at times, but again, it's just like honest to our situation in the world. Um, so yeah, tons of family stuff going on, trying, getting toward middle age, I suppose, is, spurring that on a little bit too. But yeah, I mean, I think between the family stuff, all these creatures that I'm learning about and who are teaching me, and just the places that I love. I mean, those are the things that keep coming up. I suppose my neuroses in particular are here, but I don't see those, I'm sure they're there though.
Yeah, nice. Would you mind reading a piece? Are you prepared for
Yeah,
that? Okay,
sure.
so yeah, I think that'll be a good way. Unless, well, like we could pause for a second and say, was there kind of something? There's a lot I didn't ask about. Is there something I didn't ask about that you'd want to share or kind of to say about the book before you share a piece?
I guess I'll say one thing. Because this thing, the subtitle to this collection is a Sonata Pome, Pome, not Poem, which is a little pretentious, I suppose. But I just when this thing got into my head, I couldn't let it go. And James Joyce uses it. It's some other, so I was fine with going. And Kerouac too. Kerouac has a book of poems, right? Pomes. But anyway, I guess I'll just explain it because I don't think I've explained this anywhere before. So the poem thing is just like a different way of writing the word poem. But it's a pun with French poem from, an apple, right, or fruit. And there's some early modern English uses that for a fruit as well. So the whole thing is kind of, this fruit of all these endeavors and everything. So there's just that, kind of direct thing. Um, but the sonata aspect of this is actually, as I kept writing all these things, and it just like more and more kept coming, especially when I got to leads and diggings. And I mean, it took like, I spent like a month in the back room of the flat, poring over all this stuff and trying to get this thing to come together. And like, so I was really glad I got published because it really felt like this is the thing I really worked on. Like, there was a lot of research that went into this. So I'm doing like geology books. I'm getting books from the 1840s about mining in Illinois. Like, um, but as all that started coming together, and I was like, how do I structure any of this to make it make more sense to myself and other people? It started becoming clear that there were these like four larger gatherings, and there was kind of a more substantial bit, and then these shorter poems, the observational poems you had mentioned that I had been doing, and then this really long section about the mounds, earthen mounds, which is Leads and Diggings is a part of, and some of the translations are parts of. And then there was this kind of like little sequence of apostrophes that I did on the Baraboo Hills. 'Cause it's certainly the place on earth that's nearest and dearest to my heart for various reasons I won't go into. And so they kind of fell into these four categories, and they were longer, shorter, longer, and shorter. And I was like, oh, that's actually like that's the church sonata form, from like the is it late 1600s, early 1700s, whatever it is. Maybe even a little earlier. Sorry, I'm not a music guy,
Yeah.
but all the same, I knew about that form, and I had been doing stuff with my students with sonata form and all that the year before, and that's why I knew. And I said, like, yeah, like I like that. There's a little musicality to that, and it's a traditional form, but I'm obviously doing something not traditional with it, and that's kind of my thing. Yeah, okay, sure, So a sonata poem, it was, and that's why it's called that, in case anybody's wondering. Yeah. Um, any follow up on that, Aaron, or is that good?
I know. Well, I that's news to me. Yeah, I didn't know that. So
Okay.
I appreciate.
So
Well,
I
because yeah,
illuminated that.
it does actually make a lot of sense.
Okay, cool. All right, good. Okay, good. Um, okay. So yeah, if I could, can I do two?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah. All right. So I'll do one that's a little more like the domestic, we're just here with the kids kind of thing. And then one from Leads and Diggings, just one subsection that's the kind of hundreds of millions of years ago thing. And then, it's like the collection runs the gamut between those two. Right. So here's the two poles. All right. So this is on the year's first compost, which is exactly what happened. This is just describing the scene as clearly as I could. All right. The children open eyes wide as gray winds billow through the alley. Finally, they believe that our food becomes deep, rich earth, a transformation they'd not accept on faith. The centipedes and earthworms rejoice in my work as I bucket up their troping of rebirth. Mulberries full roundabout, dark corpuscular rain, and I trowel in the compost, feeding the mouths of corn, tobacco, high balancing begonias that dance like pink chandeliers in the draft. A mama thrush sneaks in the maple leaves above, kids scuttling a swirl as I dig. One lone squash blossom flashes out in sudden relief. Life from death. Shock of yellow on black of earth. And I could still see like inside the compost bin that squash blossom had, and I until I dug out the one side I didn't see it, and I can still see it in my mind's eye. It was, yeah, it's very stark. And so much wind. It was a strange day in Milwaukee with the swirling winds going on as we were doing it. It was a fun day. Anyway, okay, so then this, yeah, again, is from Leads and Diggings, the long poem, from the second section called The Night Heron's Call. And this is the second subsection, Shallow Ocean, circa 460 to 420 million years ago. All right. Liverworts luxuriate with bryophyte kin, enzymes shattering rocky coastland as millipedes savage a newly predatory world. Cooksonia stretch their stalks to open skies, vascular tissues transporting water in the river's deltas. But in the waters shallow and infused with light, Euro-America is coming together. Untold numbers of bryozoans and cephalopods live and eat and die in their millions, leaving carbonate deposits, and wind and water and weight do their work. Great gray clouds move over the waters. Metallic salts hang suspended as sulfuretted hydrogen precipitates lead, shapes sulfurets, forming limestone. Compacts lithifies the sun across the sky. Earth orbiting as joint crevices fill, dolomite drums, clayey deposits, yellow and tough. Immense cogs crystallize as limestone ions dance with abandon, dolomitization drawing, lurching forward so slowly like sugar and brown. Seawater bathing, marine sediments, receptaculites colonizing the ocean benthos, brachiopods latched to seabed. Galena fills crevices, lays out in flats and pitches. Ordovician mineral rest on beds of passage into the drab and buff as zinc oxidizes to sphalerite. Mud piles and piles to shale, a strangulation. For now, the waves play on, crashing into the growing shore, a millennial tick. The waters subside. And
Wonderful. Thank you.
yeah, thanks. And Galena, near the end there, that's what my ancestors were mining over in the western part of the state and down into Illinois. So
Nice. Yeah, I see. Other than the kind of the narrative coming together, I see what you mean about having those fun words and phrases to play with
yeah,
once you open that open that textbook.
yes,
That's the
yes.
kind of I can see you having fun putting some of those
Yeah.
words to use on the
It
page.
was like, how do I put sulfurette into my into my poem? How am I gonna do that? It was difficult, but it was a lot of fun at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we covered a lot of ground today. So thanks again for coming on and joining me. And the book is available at the publisher website. Is that
Yep,
the place
Fernwood.
to go
Yes.
to get it?
Hmm.
And the publisher is at Fernwood.
Yes, Fernwood Press.
Fernwood Press. The book Be Radiant. So yeah, thank you for joining.
Oh, thank you so much, Aaron.